David had saved Bruno's life when he was just a dying cub, raising him with more love than most parents give their children. But as the enormous bear slowly approached him 2 years later, every person watching realized they were about to witness something that would change their understanding of wild animals forever. It all started on a cold October morning when David was hiking through the dense wilderness of northern Montana. The forest was unusually quiet, with only the crunch of fallen leaves under his boots breaking the silence. David loved these solo hikes. They gave him peace away from his demanding job as a veterinarian. He had been walking for about 2 hours when a sound stopped him dead in his tracks. It was barely audible at first, like a kitten mewing in the distance. David tilted his head, listening carefully. The sound came again, weak and desperate. Something was crying for help. His veterinarian instincts kicked, and immediately he pushed through the thick brush, following the pitiful sounds until he found their source. Beneath a massive fallen log lay the tiniest bear cub David had ever seen. The little creature was barely the size of a newborn puppy. Its dark fur matted and dirty. Its eyes were barely open, and each breath seemed like it might be its last. David looked around frantically for any sign of the mother bear, knowing how dangerous it would be if she returned. But the forest remained silent. No other cubs were visible anywhere. The cub tried to lift its head when David approached, but it was too weak. David could see that it was severely dehydrated and starving. This baby had been alone for days, maybe longer. Without help, it would be dead before nightfall. David knew he was taking an enormous risk, but his compassion overpowered his fear. He gently lifted the fragile cub, wrapping it in his fleece jacket. The tiny animal was so weak it couldn't even whimper as David carried it toward his truck, beginning a journey that would end in unimaginable terror. David named the cub Bruno, and from that very first night, the little bear became the center of his world. He set up a makeshift nursery in his spare bedroom, complete with soft blankets and heating lamps to keep Bruno warm. Every 2 hours, day and night, David would wake up to bottle feed the hungry cub with a special milk formula he mixed in his veterinary clinic. Bruno would wrap his tiny paws around the bottle, his small black eyes looking up at David with complete trust. Those first few weeks were exhausting, but magical. Bruno followed David everywhere, his little claws clicking on the hardwood floors as he waddled behind his human father. When David worked in his home office, Bruno would curl up on a pillow beside his desk, occasionally reaching out a paw to touch David's leg, as if making sure he was still there. At night, Bruno refused to sleep alone, so David let him climb into bed, where the cub would press against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. As the weeks turned into months, Bruno grew rapidly. What started as a creature small enough to hold in one hand became a playful, energetic young bear who loved nothing more than wrestling with David on the living room floor. David would get down on his hands and knees, and Bruno would pounce on him, gently biting his hands and rolling around like an oversized puppy. Their favorite game was hide and seek. Bruno would cover his eyes with his paws while David hid behind furniture. Then the young bear would lumber around the house, sniffing and searching until he found his beloved human. David treated Bruno exactly like a human child. He celebrated Bruno's first birthday with a special cake made of fish and honey. He took hundreds of photos and videos, documenting every milestone. When Bruno learned to open doors with his increasingly powerful paws, David childproofed the house. When Bruno started teething and chewed up the furniture, David bought him special toys designed for large dogs. He even set up a kiddie pool in the backyard, where Bruno could splash and play during the hot summer months. The bond between them was unlike anything David had ever experienced. Bruno seemed to understand David's moods perfectly. When David had a bad day at work, Bruno would rest his large head on David's lap, offering comfort without being asked. When David was happy, Bruno would bounce around excitedly, as if celebrating alongside him. They had their own language of sounds and gestures. A certain grunt from Bruno meant he wanted to go outside. A particular whine meant he was hungry. David could read every expression on Bruno's increasingly large face. But as Bruno approached his first birthday, the reality of the situation became impossible to ignore. The cub who once fit in David's arms now weighed over 200 pounds. His playful swipes, once harmless, now left scratches on David's arms, even when Bruno was being gentle. The young bear's strength was becoming frightening. even though his intentions remained loving. Neighbors began to complain about the sounds coming from David's property. Local authorities started asking questions. David knew their perfect life together was coming to an end, but he had no idea that their separation would lead to something far more terrifying than he could ever imagine. The breaking point came on a sunny Tuesday morning, when Bruno accidentally knocked David to ground during what should have been a simple hug. The now 300-pound bear had rushed to greet David as he always did, but this time his enthusiasm sent David crashing into the kitchen counter. The impact left David with bruised ribs and a deep gash on his arm that required 12 stitches. As David sat in the emergency room, he realized a painful truth he had been avoiding for months. Bruno was no longer safe to keep. Wildlife officials had been calling for weeks, pressuring David to surrender Bruno to a proper facility. The neighbors had filed multiple complaints, and the local authorities were threatening legal action. David's veterinary license was even at risk. But the final straw came when Dr. Sarah Mills, a wildlife expert, visited David's home and watched Bruno interact with his surrogate father. Dr. Mills explained the harsh reality that David desperately wanted to deny. Bruno was becoming sexually mature, which would make him increasingly territorial and unpredictable. His natural instincts were awakening, instincts that thousands of years of evolution had hardwired into his DNA. No amount of love could override what Bruno was programmed to become. She told David about Rocky Mountain Wildlife Preserve, a sanctuary 3 hours north, where Bruno could live safely among other rescue bears while still receiving the care he needed. The decision tore David's heart in two, but he knew Dr. Mills was right. Bruno deserved to live as a bear, not as a confused creature trapped between two worlds. David spent Bruno's last week at home, creating final memories. They took long walks through the forest where David had first found him. They shared one last fish dinner together. David took countless photos, trying to capture every detail of Bruno's face, knowing he might never see again. On the day of separation, David could barely hold back his tears as the transport team arrived. Bruno seemed to sense something was wrong. He kept pressing against David's legs, making soft, whimpering sound that David had never heard before. When the time came to load Bruno into the specially designed transport cage, the bear looked back at David with confused, pleading eyes that would haunt David's dreams for years to come. As the truck disappeared down the mountain road, David collapsed to his knees in his empty driveway, sobbing like he had never sobbed before. He had just given away the most important relationship of his life, never imagining that their next meeting would end in absolute terror. The silence in David's house was deafening. For weeks after Bruno left, David would wake up in the middle of the night, listening for the familiar sounds of his bear moving around the house. He kept Bruno's favorite toys in a box in the closet, unable to throw them away but too heartbroken to look at them. His friends tried to convince him to get a dog, but David couldn't bear the thought of replacing Bruno with another animal. Every few months, David would call the wildlife preserve for updates. The staff assured him that Bruno was doing well, adapting to life with other bears and thriving in his natural environment. They sent occasional photos that showed Bruno had grown massive, now weighing over 600 pounds of pure muscle. In the pictures, he looked wild and magnificent, but David searched desperately for any sign of the gentle cub he had raised. The bear in those photos looked like a stranger. As the second anniversary of their separation approached, David became obsessed with the idea of visiting Bruno. Dr. Mills had warned him that reunions were rarely successful and often dangerous, but David couldn't shake the feeling that Bruno would remember him. After all, they had been family. Love like that doesn't just disappear, David told himself over and over, against the advice of everyone who cared about him. David made the phone call to Rocky Mountain Wildlife Preserve. He begged them to arrange a supervised visit, promising to follow every safety protocol. After weeks of discussions and legal waivers, they finally agreed to let him see Bruno from a safe distance. The drive to the preserve felt like the longest 3 hours of David's life. His hands shook on the steering wheel as he imagined their reunion. He had no idea that he was driving toward the most terrifying moment of his life, one that would shatter everything he believed about love, loyalty, and the true nature of wild animals. Rocky Mountain Wildlife Preserve stretched across hundreds of acres of pristine wilderness, surrounded by towering pine trees and protected by heavy-duty fencing designed to keep both bears in and curious visitors out. David arrived on a crisp autumn morning, his heart pounding with anticipation and nerves. Dr. Mills and 3 other wildlife experts met him at the visitor center, their faces serious as they reviewed the safety protocols one final time. The group walked along a reinforced viewing platform that overlooked Bruno's enclosure, a massive habitat that resembled natural forest terrain. David gripped the metal railing, scanning the landscape for any sign of his beloved Bruno. For nearly 20 minutes, they saw nothing but trees and shadows. David began to worry that Bruno might be sleeping or hiding in a den somewhere deep in preserve. Then Dr. Mills pointed toward a cluster of oak trees near the far edge of the enclosure. Something large and dark was moving between the trunks. David's breath caught in his throat as a massive brown bear emerged into a clearing about 200 yards away. Even at that distance, David knew immediately it was Bruno. The bear was enormous, easily twice the size he had been when David last saw him. His shoulders were broad and powerful, his coat thick and glossy from living in the wild. Bruno seemed to be foraging for food, his massive head down as he searched through fallen leaves. David whispered Bruno's name, knowing the bear was too far away to hear him. But something incredible happened. Bruno's head snapped up suddenly, his ears forward and alert. He turned toward the viewing platform, and David swore he could see recognition in those dark eyes, even from such a great distance. The other staff members exchanged worried glances as Bruno began moving toward them. His pace was slow and deliberate, not the rush excitement David had hoped for, but something that made the wildlife experts shift nervously. Dr. Mills placed a firm hand on David's shoulder, reminding him to stay calm and avoid making any sudden movements or sounds. As Bruno drew closer, David could see just how truly massive his former cub had become. This was no longer the playful young bear who used to curl up in his bed. This was an apex predator, a creature built for survival in the wilderness. Bruno's muscles rippled beneath his thick fur with each step, and his claws, now several inches long, left deep marks in the soft earth. At about 50 yards away, Bruno stopped and stood on his hind legs, rising to his full height of nearly 8 feet. He was testing the air, trying to catch David's scent. The viewing platform fell completely silent, except for the sound of nervous breathing. David felt tears forming in his eyes as he prepared to call out to his beloved Bruno, having no idea that what happened next would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. Bruno dropped back down to all fours and continued his approach, but something in his movement made Dr. Mills grab David's arm with white knuckles. The bear's body language had changed completely. His ears were no longer full with curiosity, but pinned back against his massive skull. His lips began to pull back, revealing teeth that were now the size of a grown man's fingers. This was not the joyful recognition David had dreamed about for 2 years. David called out softly, his voice trembling with emotion. "Bruno, it's me. It's David." The sound of his voice had an immediate and terrifying effect. Bruno's massive head swung toward them, and he released a low rumble that seemed to vibrate to the ground itself. But instead of the happy sounds David remembered, this was something primal and threatening. This was the sound of a predator that had identified a target. Bruno began moving faster now, his enormous paws thudding against the earth with increasing urgency. At 30 yards, he broke into what could only be described as a charge. The wildlife experts screamed for everyone to get back from the railing, but David stood frozen, unable to process what he was seeing. This couldn't be his Bruno. This couldn't be the gentle cub who used to fall asleep listening to his heartbeat. The massive bear slammed into the reinforced fence with such force that the entire viewing platform shook. The sound was like a car crash, metal groaning and bending under the impact of 700 pounds of pure muscle and fury. Bruno immediately reared up on his hind legs again, this time clawing at the fence with those razor-sharp claws, trying to climb over or tear through the barrier that separated him from David. What happened next made everyone's blood run cold. Bruno began making sounds that none of the wildlife experts had ever heard before. It was a combination of roaring, snarling, and something that sounded almost like screaming. His eyes, once so gentle and trusting, were now filled with something that looked like pure rage. Foam and saliva dripped from his open mouth as he continued his assault on the fence. Dr. Mills yanked David away from the railing, just as Bruno managed to get his front paws over the top of the 12-foot fence. The bear's claws scraped against the metal platform, missing David's feet by inches. 2 security guards rushed onto the platform with tranquilizer guns, but Bruno was so enraged that he seemed oblivious to the darts that hit him in the shoulder and neck. David collapsed to his knees on the platform, his mind unable to accept what he was witnessing. This creature that was trying so desperately to reach him, not to embrace him but to attack him, was the same baby bear he had bottle-fed and tucked into bed every night. The same gentle soul who used to comfort him when he was sad. The recognition was there in Bruno's eyes, but it wasn't the loving recognition David had expected. It was something far more terrifying. Even as the tranquilizers began to take effect, Bruno continued his attempts to reach David. His movements became slower and more unsteady, but the aggressive intent never faded from his eyes. He fought the drugs with every ounce of his massive strength, determined to get to the human who had once been his whole world. As Bruno finally collapsed near the fence, still conscious but unable to move, David realized a horrible truth that would haunt him forever. Bruno did remember him. The bear knew exactly who David was. But instead of triggering love and affection, David's presence had awakened something primitive and territorial in Bruno's brain. In the wild bear's mind, David was no longer family. David was an intruder, a threat that needed to be eliminated. The silence that followed was broken only by David's sobbing and heavy breathing of everyone who had just witnessed the most terrifying demonstration of wild animal nature any of them had ever seen. In the weeks that followed the terrifying encounter, David struggled to understand what had gone so horribly wrong. Dr. Mills sat with him in her office, explaining the harsh reality that David had refused to accept for so long. Bruno's aggressive behavior wasn't betrayal or a sign that he had forgotten their bond. It was actually proof of how deeply their connection had affected him, but in ways that David never could have anticipated. During Bruno's critical early development, David had become his primary attachment figure, the center of his universe. But when Bruno was moved to preserve, his bear instincts began to emerge and clash with these human attachments. In the wild, adult male bears are solitary and territorial creatures. They don't form lasting social bonds except briefly for mating. Bruno's brain was trying to reconcile 2 incompatible realities: his deep emotional connection to David and his biological programming as a wild predator. Dr. Mills explained that Bruno's violent reaction was likely triggered by confusion and frustration. His bear instincts told him to be territorial and aggressive, while his early imprinting made David significant in ways that his wild brain couldn't properly process. The result was a dangerous psychological conflict that manifested as explosive aggression. Bruno wasn't trying to hurt David out of malice. He was responding to David as both a territorial threat and a deeply important figure from his past, creating a perfect storm of conflicted emotions. The most heartbreaking truth was that Bruno's response proved just how much David had meant to him. A wild bear encountering a stranger would typically avoid human contact or display simple defensive behavior. But Bruno's intense, focused aggression toward David specifically showed that their bond had never been forgotten. Unfortunately, that bond had become twisted by Bruno's wild nature into something dangerous and unpredictable. David learned that this type of reaction was not uncommon among animals that had been raised by humans and then returned to the wild. Their brains become wired during crucial development periods to see humans as family, but their adult instincts can't reconcile this programming with their natural behaviors. Love, no matter how pure and deep, cannot override millions of years of evolutionary programming. The preserve staff assured David that Bruno was not suffering or unhappy in his current life, away from human contact. He was a perfectly normal wild bear who got along well with other bears and showed no signs of aggression or distress. The problem only arose when confronted with a human who had raised him. It was a tragic reminder that wild animals, no matter how much love they receive or give in return, can never truly be domesticated. David eventually came to understand that his love for Bruno had been real and meaningful, but it was a love that belonged to a brief moment in time when Bruno was young and vulnerable. The massive, dangerous bear at the fence was not a corruption of the gentle cub David had raised. It was a natural evolution of that same creature, following the biological destiny that had always been written in his DNA. The experience changed David's perspective on wildlife conservation forever. He became an advocate for keeping wild animals wild, supporting programs that rehabilitate orphaned animals without human attachment. He learned that true love for a wild animal sometimes means accepting that they belong in a world where humans cannot follow, no matter how much it breaks your heart to let them go. If stories like Bruno and David's have touched your heart and made you think differently about our relationship with wild animals, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that will challenge everything you think you know about the natural world. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads, and share this story with someone who needs to understand the complex truth about loving wild animals.